Hi, I'm Roberto. In this video, you will see the third and final part of my conversation with Professor James Lamiell, which was about his book from 2019 titled Psychologists, Misuse of Statistics, and the Persistent Dismissal of its Critics. So by now, if you have seen the previous two videos, you probably have a good idea about what the book is about. But this part actually was a bit more personal for what Professor Lamiell and I discussed, because it talks about the historical developments that led to the occurrence and presence of statisticism, which is what the book is about in psychology, but especially about the story of Professor Lamiell's development as a psychologist and how he ended up writing and basically researching on this topic. So if you still don't know what this book is about, check my book commentary video, check the previous parts of my conversation with Professor Lamiell, and in the end, I hope you enjoy this last entry of this interview as much as I did. So here we go.
Yeah, and I will say that when I started down this road, I did not intend to do history, and I really didn't know much more about William Stern than that he had been influential in the early years of the development of intelligence testing. Beyond that, I didn't know much. When my basic insight that started all of this, when as I described in the second chapter of the book, when I was teaching at the University of Illinois, and students were asking me how to interpret correlation coefficients and R-square coefficients with regard to the question of consistency or the inconsistency of individuals in their expression of their personality characteristics. And what was sticking me is that I could not give them a clear answer. And it really bothered me. And finally, I came to realize that I couldn't give them a clear answer because there wasn't any clear answer. What psychologists, personality psychologists, were interpreting as empirical evidence relevant to the question of temporal and transsituational consistency of individuals were being interpreted incorrectly. And that got me to thinking about eventually, the one thing I did know in this domain of historical interest was the so nomothetic idiographic distinction, as it had been drawn, at least in psychology, by Gordon Allport. And my reference to Gordon Allport and fleeting references to the person that he referenced, namely Wilhelm Windelband, the German philosopher, was about all the history that was in there. That was a scant bit. My interest was not primarily in the history, but in correcting a basic conceptual problem in the field. Personality investigators were interpreting these so-called consistency coefficients in inappropriate ways. And I may have mentioned to you last week that this all came out for the first time in an American Psychologist article that I published in 1981 in the American Psychologist. That prompted an invitation from a Belgian scholar who's now deceased, Jean-Pierre de Walle, to come to Germany in 1984 and give a presentation at the Second European Conference on Personality. It was at that conference that I was asked by a German scholar whose name is Lothar Laux. He's retired, but he's still active at the University of Bamberg in Germany. If I knew William Stern, if I knew of William Stern. I said, oh yeah, he's the IQ guy. He kind of chuckled at me and so on. And Laux it was, and then there were others who encouraged me to look further into Stern's work. because he had expressed views, places in his works that these German scholars, people who knew Stern better than I did,
Yeah.
they knew that Stern had expressed similar views. And they were trying to help me. And that was really the beginning of my historical inquiries. But again, as I may have told you last week, if I get to repeating it, tell me about it, I'll stop. I didn't know German then.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I set about learning German. And my first sabbatical was in 1990. And I went to Heidelberg. And by then, I could kind of read slowly German textbooks with the help of a dictionary right by my side. You know, it was very slow going. But it was there that I started reading things that William Stern had written. And this prompted me further to explore Stern's works. And of course, it gave me further motivation to learn German.
Yeah.
And as I got more comfortable with German, I was able to read more and more of what Stern wrote. But knowing some German then opened up other writers for me, like Windelband. All I knew about Windelband was what I had heard people saying about Windelband. And so finally, I went and I read Windelband. Not what people were saying about Windelband, but Windelband.
Yeah.
And I discovered in what Windelband actually wrote that it was quite a bit different. He did, of course, introduce the terms nomothetic and ideographic.
Yeah.
But what he meant by nomothetic was something quite different from the way in which contemporary personality psychologists, including Allport, had come to use the terms. And this was my first, I think, historical experience, that when you study historical works and do historical work, you give yourself the advantage of finding out things about writers, about literature, that turn out to be a bit different from the way they're often presented by others who have their information secondhand. So with this, I was not only anymore a psychologist with methodological concerns, but I was also becoming a psychologist with philosophical and historical interests. And those interests have informed me every step of the way from the early 1980s until now. And they continue to inform me. It's quite so. And an additional feature which has become dimmer and dimmer at least in our science, and I think you'd find this in other sciences as well, though I'm not informed enough about other sciences to say, is an increasingly narrow concentration on empirical questions. Mm-hmm. And not much of an appreciation, this is certainly true in psychology, not much of an appreciation for conceptual questions. And good science necessarily raises conceptual questions. There are some questions that cannot be answered by doing an experiment. It can only be answered by careful, critical thought. You don't discover empirically that the Pearson product moment correlation coefficient, when it's calculated on variables of individual differences, is not interpretable for individuals. That's not an empirical, I didn't do a study and oh my goodness, you see what I mean?
Yeah.
These are conceptual questions. And in a field that is ever less rewarding of conceptual questions, many workers in the field will avoid them. There's no payoff. I had a senior colleague at the University of Illinois when I was working on that American Psychologist paper, which is about all I worked on for 2 years. I submitted it 4 times to the American Psychologist before it got accepted. And I had a senior colleague who he was looking out for me. And he took me aside and he said, you know, you're young, you're untenured, you should put that aside and go do some empirical studies so that you will have enough publications to get tenure when the time comes. And so, Roberto, I had to decide, am I going to put this aside and start busy myself in the kind of research that I knew wasn't right for conceptual reasons? Or am I going to keep going with this? And I decided I'm going to keep going with it. And if 3-4 years down the line I didn't get tenure, well, I'll take my chances. But I couldn't see myself doing the very sort of work that quietly I was critiquing. So one really has to struggle that way. And I think it's as much or more the case now in the mainstream of the field than it was in my younger days at the University of Illinois, though by then, and certainly at Illinois, it had taken root. Now, so I didn't get tenure at Illinois. I had to look around for another job, and poor me, I ended up getting a job at a university where there was a lot of appreciation for conceptual work. And so I ended up, partly by good fortune, in a place that would be very nurturant of the kind of work that I was engaged in. And so it worked out. But for a lot of people, it wouldn't. Yeah. And I often get the question from people, well, how have these false views, these incorrect views, remained in place so firmly over the years? And part of the reason for that, I think, is unchecked false portrayals of the sort to which Stern was subjected. People didn't read Stern. And although that was at the very beginning, in the early 1900s, most scholars in the field, wherever they were, including the US, could read German. But over the years, that has dissipated. And so people are no longer reading Windelband. They're no longer reading Wundt. They're no longer reading Stern. At most, they read what people have written about Wundt and Windelband and Stern. And if what's been written about them isn't accurate, but it is widely and uncritically accepted because the people who are accepting it haven't ever read the originals, well, that builds up a kind of a justification for what they're doing that becomes ever more difficult to dislodge. Yeah. So that's part of the problem. And as I went on to graduate school, when I was in graduate school, I was in my research methods classes, I was assigned to read, for example, David Bakan's papers that I cite in there. And they hit me, but I can remember this very vividly. I'm thinking, Bakan is saying something is basically wrong with the way in which we do research. But my instructors are not furthering that. They had me read it, so that's good. And I knew it was out there. But I'm a graduate student, and I don't yet have the guts or even the wherewithal to say, you know, what you're doing there runs against what Bakan is saying. And so I've either got to hear a rebuttal of Bakan's argument, or I'm going to do what Bakan's doing. You know, there's you can't just ignore it. But so I applaud my instructors from graduate school days in exposing me to that literature. But it wasn't convincing in a way that persuaded me at the beginning to move to conduct myself as a researcher more in accordance with Bakan's insights, which were considerable.
Yeah.
Kerlinger, in 1979, by that time I was done with graduate school, I was at Illinois. I must say, I never read that material that I cited in my 2019 book. I had not familiarized myself with before, and so in a sense that was kind of new for me. And this paradox that he calls troublesome paradox, I could see eventually that was the same problem that Bakan was talking about. Interestingly enough, Kerlinger didn't cite Bakan, even though they were talking about the same thing, and he should have. Because Kerlinger turned out to be a pretty prominent person in the area of research methods. I don't know if you've run across his name or been assigned his textbooks or whatnot. Maybe they're not still. I mean, I've been away from it for a while, so I don't know. But he had a research methods textbook out that went to at least 2 editions, maybe 3 editions, and was quite successful. So a lot of people were reading that. And it just didn't take on. And then when and I mentioned this, I know, last week, and it's in the book, Ann Anastasia and Leona Tyler, the way they looked at Stern's 2 differential psychology books in ways that fundamentally at odds with what Stern had insisted, that the 1911 book was not to be regarded as a revised or second edition of the 1900 book. He said things in the 1911 book that he had not said in the 1900 book. There's nothing in the 1911 book that undid or contradicted what he said in 1900, but he added additional material that really changed the whole perspective. And Anastasia and Tyler, in their textbooks, which were hugely influential really through most of the 20th century, people who were taking psychometric theory, psychological testing, that kind of thing, they ended up essentially buying and perpetrating Stern's circumscription of the business of differential psychology as he had described it in 1900. But the 1911 book changed it. It expanded it, is what he actually did. He didn't abandon what he said in 1900, but he altered, he expanded the field in ways that fundamentally changed the landscape. And it all got ignored by Anastasia, by Tyler, the authors of the 2 biggest textbooks in the field throughout the 20th century. When Kurt Pawlik, a German, at the University of Hamburg, where Stern spent the latter half of his academic career, published the facsimile edition of Stern's 1911 book in 1994, I believe, somewhere around there, 1995. Mm-hmm. He too referred to the 1911 book as a second edition. This boggles my mind. I mean, I know, or at least if I can believe Anastasia, what she said, she read German, and she was aware of both editions, both of Stern's, they're not editions, they're both of Stern's differential psychology texts. Leona Tyler writes things in her work that suggest that maybe she didn't read German all that much, so okay, we cut her a break there. And as I note again in the book, she did, later in her career, she wrote some unpublished papers in the 1980s in which she chastised herself for having too narrow a view of what Stern had said.
I have that quote, and yeah, Leona Tyler, right?
Right.
That's what we're talking about. I have the quote here because, again, I really like that you put not just this, but quite a few examples of these changes of thinking or acknowledgements of, okay, maybe that was not the case, or maybe something was not that clear. And I have the quote from Leona Tyler here. That was, because my teaching specialty has been individual differences, I have known of Stern for a long time, paid proper respect to him in historical introductions and textbooks, but never deepened my understanding. Reading further, I realized that I had been giving him credit for just those things he would not have wished to be remembered for. And that I mean, I think, like you said, it's a good thing. This is a good thing to do.
It is.
Like at some point acknowledge, okay, just to be clear, this was like this, it was like that. But it talks also about the repercussions or about the way that thinking in general, but thinking also in a field such as science and psychology especially, yeah, it's a huge thing that somehow one has to always should be critical about certain facts or certain, I don't know, traditions or standards, as sometimes is mentioned, because yeah, one can easily make assumptions where maybe things are not so easily
Exactly so.
be easily taken, right?
Exactly so. And I tell you, well, let me, I'll come back to Tyler in a moment, but I'll finish off with Pawlik.
Yeah.
That was stunning because he knows German. He's a native German.
Yeah.
And he was at the very university where Stern spent half of his career, and still he characterized the relationship between those two books by Stern in, I will gently call it incorrect way. And a harsher word would be false, deliberately false way. But, when I was on sabbatical in Hamburg in 2004, I was invited to give a guest lecture for the psychology department. And I chose to lecture on William Stern as the origin myth of differential psychology. And that's essentially the presentation that I gave in Akron in 2011. Did I send you the link to the
one
video?
that is recorded, yeah.
Okay. Well, I gave a version of that talk in German at Hamburg in 2004. And Pawlik, of course, was there. I knew he would be. That's his little domain. And he was not very happy with me. And in the question answer session at the end of the first, he shot up his hand right away. And he really almost, I could say, berated me because the presentation that I'd given on Stern was, quote, too one-sided. I'm presenting all this material that I'm betting you 90% of the people in that room never saw. And what they've been seeing is this Stern, the tester, the differential psychologist, and that's in all the textbooks and it's been going on for years. And Pawlik gets up and tells me that my presentation was too one-sided. I don't know if this particular material is suited for your interview tape or not, but anyway, that's the way it went. Now, by contrast, I also had occasion during my years at Georgetown to meet Leona Tyler. I never met Anastasia, but I met Leona Tyler. And she, by this time, this was well into the 80s, and she has already written the passage that you just quoted, and her thinking has begun to change, and she has realized that it has changed in a direction more compatible with the way Stern's thinking developed. And she was a very, very gracious woman, and she was very happy. By this time, she's pretty old. But she was very happy with me for developing my interest in Stern's work and trying to bring his ideas to the attention of contemporary scholars. So I have very high regard for Leona Tyler. Even though that Psych of Individual Differences textbook that she wrote, and it went through many editions, doesn't characterize Stern's view of differential psychology in the way that it should have. At least she came to acknowledge that in a way that Anastasi never did, to my point of view, and I know Kurt Pawlik never did. So those are the three historical figures that I talked about in there. Well, I also talked earlier were Thorndike and Münsterberg.
Yeah.
But when heavyweights in the field adopt these views and they kind of take hold, and then generation after generation of students reads these ideas in textbooks, you know, when you pose the question, why is there such this resistance to change? There's such this incorrigibility within the field. That's a lot of inertia that accumulates, and it's really tough to break down. And the only other thing I would add there is, and I might have mentioned this as well last week, that I've been told on occasions over the years by students and even by professional colleagues, professors, for example, one professor at Heidelberg, the students would either say, well, I know you're right, but what do I do instead? I got to get my degree. A faculty colleague in Heidelberg told me, he said, I know you're right, but I'm too old to change now. And so he was going to keep on going. And this man was on a mission to pile up publications. He just loved to pile up publications. And so it's hard to convey these stories gently in published literature, you know, but and so I kind of try to stay away from them, apart from the bare bones. But this kind of stuff goes on.
Yeah.
And it's part of the true story about how these ideas get so entrenched that it becomes almost impossible to dislodge. He was he was born in 1871 in Berlin, and he went to university at what was then called the University of Berlin, which is now called the Humboldt University of Berlin. Have you ever been to Berlin?
Once. Barely, for a conference.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the main entrance to the Humboldt University is right on the main thoroughfare in the former East Berlin, Unter den Linden. I don't know how much of a chance you got to acquaint yourself with the city, but from the days of my sabbatical in Heidelberg, 1990, up to today, I met a gentleman, a native East German person by the name of Frank Rothke in 1990, and I've remained friends with him for many years. And the point here, it's given me occasion to go back often to Berlin. So I've had the opportunity to be there many times and to really see how the city developed from the time that the wall came down. Remember, that was November of 1989. I was to a Fulbright Scholars Conference in Berlin in March of 1990.
Mhm.
So we're just talking about a couple of months. And East Berlin at that time was still very much East Berlin. And I've been back, as I say, many, many times over the years and kind of seen it, how it has changed. So that's a magnificent thing. Anyway, Stern went to college, university in Berlin. And one of his major professors there was Hermann Ebbinghaus
Mhm.
of experimental psychology, the memory experiments and all that. But another one of the professors on the faculty there was Wilhelm Dilthey, who issued a call for essentially a psychology modeled on Geisteswissenschaften, or the human sciences, or what we call more often in humanities, or in English, the humanities. I don't know how they're referred to in Spanish.
Humanidades, yeah, the same.
Humanitas.
Yeah, yeah, because human sciences, also in Spanish academic language, I don't think so. It's but I was also discussing that topic. I think in several countries, of course, some people, or the discussion is ongoing, right, about psychology should be more here or there. So basically, I think everybody's struggling, probably because of this kind of conceptual lack of conceptual thinking, or looking back at what has been told. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Dilthey issued what's become kind of a famous, well, first it was a speech, then it was an article or a set of articles calling for psychology on the human science model.
Mm-hmm.
Ebbinghaus, at the same university, on the same faculty, published a reply to Dilthey's piece and gave a fierce defense of psychology on the natural science model. So here's William Stern, as a student there at the time, kind of caught between the two of these. Apparently, because Stern makes reference a couple of places, just very briefly, to the idea that Dilthey was a kind of a difficult person. You can imagine the grumpy old German professor, and when you're a student and you meet someone like, it's kind of intimidating. And that was at least perhaps part of the reason that he spent more time with Ebbinghaus. But Ebbinghaus and Dilthey represented such two different views of scientific psychology, and as Stern's own life and thinking would unfold, it was clear that he was much more compatible with Dilthey than with Ebbinghaus. And in his 1927 Selbstdarstellung, or the self-portrait, he expressed his regret that as a student, he had not been able to take more advantage of his proximity to Dilthey. And Stern was never an antagonistic toward a psychology, a part of psychology being modeled on the natural sciences. But he was very wary of those with the natural science commitment overreaching, overstepping the proper boundaries, and that a scientific psychology would have to include a portion that was modeled more on the humanities or the human sciences. So he had a mixture of Ebbinghaus and Dilthey. If he were here and you say, all right, Professor Stern, you got to pick one or the other, which one do you more favor? I'm sure it would be Dilthey and the human science model. And I think that becomes even clearer as his career goes along. But Ebbinghaus left Berlin in around 1894, 95 to take over the directorship of the Psychology Institute at the University of Breslau, which is now Wrocław, Poland, but at that time it was Breslau. There was an opening for a young faculty member. Ebbinghaus encouraged Stern to go there, which Stern did. in 1897. So he was once again in close proximity, collegial proximity to Ebbinghaus. Stern, the first differential psychology textbook appeared in 1900. So he had been at Breslau for just a few years, a couple of years, 3 years. In 1899, he married Clara Josefi, a sweetheart from Berlin, and they began their married life together then in Breslau. In 1900, their first child was born, daughter Hilda, and that's when the Sterns started keeping these what came to be called the baby diaries or the child diaries. And this was the basis for his extensive and very rich contributions to what was called at the time child psychology. It would now be called more developmental psychology, but that's what it was. And so this is a whole line of substantial work on Stern's part that the people who think of him as the IQ guy would never know. The Sterns then had a son, Günther, in 1902, second daughter, Eva, in 1904, and they kept diaries on each of those three children from birth to puberty. So this is a tremendous amount of work. And that, as I say, is largely the basis for his contributions to developmental psychology, child psychology. And that work continued along with his interest in developmental differential psychology and intelligence testing. In 1915, there came an opening at the University of Hamburg to replace Ernst Neumann, who had set up an educational psychology institute there. But Neumann passed away very suddenly, and Stern applied for the job, got the job, and the family moved then from Breslau to Hamburg in 1916. This is right in the middle of World War I.
Yeah.
And there was no university there yet, mind you. But Stern believed, properly as it turned out, that the prospects for founding the university were good in Hamburg. And thanks in part to his efforts, but some others as well, that happened in 1919. The university was established, and one of the stipulations by Stern on his taking the job in Hamburg was that when the university came, he would have the opportunity to teach not only psychology but philosophy. He was persuaded, firmly convinced throughout his career that psychology and philosophy had to have firm bridges between them. This was essential. On this point, he was in full agreement with Wundt, who had argued in 1913 in that paper, Psychology Struggle for Existence, that if psychology and philosophy split, this would eventually be very bad for psychology. It would hurt philosophy, as Wundt said, but it would be really very, very bad for psychology. And in my opinion, that's exactly what has happened. But that's another story, or at least partly another story. So Stern continued his work. He was doing empirical work in the Psych Institute. He was also doing conceptual, philosophical work, completing the second and third volumes of the 3-volume set of Person and Thing, which is his exposition of his entire system of thought that he called critical personalism. And so he was very busy. He was very productive. He came to be a person of quite high regard, not only in German psychology, but in other places as well, including the United States, at the famous 1919 conference at in Massachusetts, in Worcester, Massachusetts, at Holy Cross, I think it was Holy Cross University, in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was organized by G. Stanley Hall. Ebbinghaus had been invited to participate in the conference. However, he died suddenly in 1909, and Stern was asked to take his place. So he came to the United States in that 1909 conference. I said Holy Cross. It was not Holy Cross. It was Clark University, which is also in Worcester, Massachusetts. I just got the school. And I say that simply to corroborate the point that Stern had an international reputation. He was invited to conferences in Paris, in Moscow, in many, many different places. So he was a big light in psychology at that time in the early 20th century. But of course, Hitler comes to power on January 29th, 1933. And immediately, Stern, as a Jew, was barred from all contact with students, all entry at the research laboratories. He was essentially cut off from the university. And eventually, he became persuaded that he and Clara would suffer great physical harm, perhaps even death, if they did not flee Germany. So they did, and for a very brief time, a couple of months, I don't know exactly how long, they were in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. And he was working on his general psychology text that was finally finished up when he was in the Netherlands. And the press, Nijhoff, it's a Dutch press, agreed not only to publish Stern's book, but to publish it in German, which was quite something.
Yeah.
And so that book, it's a general psychology from a personalistic standpoint, was published in German in 1935. In that year, Stern fled with Clara to the United States and accepted a position at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, where a faculty member there by the name of William McDougall had arranged for him to have a position. And unfortunately, his best work as a scholar was done by then. He didn't accomplish anything of great notable merit while he was at Duke. For one thing, he struggled with the language. He was teaching there, and you know, teaching in English was a great struggle for him, and it must have been very sad for him as well to have had to leave Germany and all of his life, his commitments in there. And he had a heart attack and died in March of 1938. So he was not quite yet 68 years old. It was about a month before his 68th birthday. Well, hell, I'm 70. You know, so I
to be honest, I mean, for somebody of his career and let's say intellectual power, or effort or work, yeah, it's a shame that it happens like that. Yeah,
it is, and I've often wondered, given the claims, for example, that were being made, or the way of thinking that was being espoused by first Thorndike and Münsterberg, but then also Anastasia. I think the first edition of her book, well, it didn't appear until maybe like 1937. It could have been too late. I'm just wondering if Stern had lived longer, if he himself might have been able to correct some of what was going off the rails. We'll never know. Well, he certainly was a very modest person.
How do you know? I mean, sorry, I just want to throw the question out there.
Right. I have read.
He has an autobiography, I think, right? He also
It's not a complete autobiography.
intellectual
It is
autobiography.
the Selbstdarstellung. It's a self-presentation, but specifically of the course of his intellectual life.
Right.
So it's not exactly an autobiography. There is a biography, one German language. There's no English language biography yet in existence. I've kind of had it as one of my missions to do that. And doing it looks like it would require me to go to his archives in Jerusalem and spend some time reading some of his private correspondence. The published works are pretty much accessible, but some of the more private things, notes, and perhaps some correspondence, I could find there. In any case, the biographer of Stern, whose name is Gerhard Bühring, lives in Berlin. In his biography, he indicates that Stern was a very modest and non-self-assuming man. The late Werner Deutsch, who was my colleague in Germany, also I forget the name of the town now. Jesus, things Braunschweig. He did some historical inquiry on Stern at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics, which is in Nijmegen.
Yeah.
He argues this as well. And in addition, there is a book of letters, Stern letters to the philosopher Jonas Kohn, that was put together and published by Helmut Lück in Germany. And these are personal letters, although they cover some professional matters as well. And my own judgment, reading those letters, is that they are written by a person who was very modest and very respectful, and so on. So that's kind of my answer to your question.
No, I mean,
it's the best I have.
And let's say, yeah.
And you think of somebody like J.B. Watson, the behaviorist.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I never met him or anything like. He died in like 1956. But if you look at some of the stuff he's written, you can he's a very bombastic guy, and Stern wasn't like that. So that's part of it. Werner Deutsch, it was, who speculated in one of the things he wrote that was part of the reason that Stern never founded a school. For example, there's no William Stern school side. There's critical personalism, but who talks about that? And so I think he tended to be a quiet, modest, non-self-assuming person. The book helps to explain all that, but in a very concise way. I was asked when I gave my series of public lectures in Hamburg. I don't know if I told you about this, but when I did my sabbatical in Hamburg, I had held the Ernst Cassirer guest professorship in the philosophy seminar at the University of Hamburg. And part of my duty there was to give a series of public lectures, typically one a week, on the life and works of William Stern. And this was something done in tradition of what existed in Hamburg before the university was founded. I told you that before, at the beginning, when Stern went there in 1916, there was no university there, but they did hold what they called a series of public lectures. And so scholars in Hamburg, or sometimes scholars coming through Hamburg on their way to other places, would be asked to give a lecture. And so there was a tradition of public lectures. And later, the philosophy department, contemporary philosophy department in Hamburg, came up with an endowed chair to host some person each semester or one semester per year to come to Hamburg and give a series of lectures on this and this and no. And I was asked one year to come to Hamburg and lecture on Stern, which I did. And I talked about critical personalism. Certainly I must have mentioned it during the very first lecture. And one of the philosophy professors at Hamburg said, what exactly does critical personalism mean? Which I think is part of your question.
Yes.
And the shortest answer I know of is this. Stern contrasted critical personalism with naive personalism, I'll be back to that, and impersonalism.
And what, sorry?
Impersonalism. I am.
Yeah. Okay.
Impersonalism. He was dissatisfied with these two already existing schools of thought for different reasons. Naive personalism is essentially a form of Cartesian dualism. It postulates that there's a mind and a body, and they're kind of separate entities, and one influences the other. Stern was of the view, as were many other philosophers over the years, that this dualism is very conceptually unsatisfactory. And so he wanted a personalism, but he didn't want it to be a naive personalism. And again, I'll come back to that. The other and bigger roadblock in psychology, as far as Stern was concerned, was essentially a kind of mechanistic impersonalism. There's no person at all. There is just a collection of parts that somehow function together in a highly mechanical way, causally determined to do this and that and the other thing. And there really isn't any person qua person as such at all. It's just a collection of parts. Very mechanical, very impersonal, and he wanted an alternative to that too. So he wanted to frame a critical personalism is one that posits what he called at first a psychophysically neutral entity. That is to say, you're not constituted, Roberto, from the start by two separate entities, your mind and your body. The person is psychophysically neutral, fundamentally speaking. It's neither mind nor body. It's a psychophysically neutral entity, and that when you speak, when you move, when you walk, it's not your mind doing this part and your body doing that part. It's Roberto doing it, you see. It's all together. And for analytic purposes, scientific purposes, we can discuss components of this psychophysically neutral entity. And that word is tricky. Mentalistic aspects and physicalistic aspects. But you're not separate aspects like that from the start. Mm-hmm. In order for one to sensibly talk about a person's mind and a person's body, you must first posit the existence of the person. You see? Yeah. I can't talk about the person Roberto as the mental Roberto and the physical Roberto until I have first established the person, the psychophysically neutral entity of Roberto, you see? So that psychophysically neutral entity is prior to any meaningful discussion of the parts. And with that, he does away with naive personalism, which says that the person is part mind and part body from the start. And with impersonalism, which says that there's not really any person there to begin with. There's only a machine. Ja, Studien zur Personenwissenschaft, erster Teil, Personalistik als Wissenschaft. Studies in the Science of Persons, Part 1, Personalistics as Science. I've never seen a Part 2.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yes, and that's why I was going to here as an answer to your question. No, I don't think he did finish. And I, even if the Part 2 had come out, I don't know.
I mean, it's not an easy thing to solve.
Right. I don't think he ever would have rested easy. There'd always be something more to write,
Yeah.
But that book, the 1930 book, is that's the concrete evidence I have that he was pursuing these ideas right up to then. Now he got, again, the general psychology text came out in 1935. And I don't know exactly what happened to the Part 2 volume of Studien zur Personenwissenschaft. Maybe he just found that the general psychology book was too large of a task, and then he put Part 2 aside so he could do the general psychology book, and then he did that. So that's speculation on my part, but I think it may be the way it was. Yeah, his life was in turmoil after 1933. He moved around. He maintained a residence in Hamburg because he couldn't get his pension, any sort of pension check, unless he did. Even after he went to the States, he had to come back to Germany on a couple of occasions so that he could pick up, because the Nazi government would not send it to wherever he had gone in the States. So, but he, and as I told you, he was for a while in the Netherlands. He, that disrupts a person's life, and it's pretty hard to write and get any continuity going when you have all these disruptions in your life. So, but I think I did the book I've described to you with the translations, and now I'm kind of trying to put together my ideas for a prospectus for another book that would pursue the ideas of a critically personalistic psychology, but in my words, not anymore in translations from Stein. So we'll see where that goes. I would want them to appreciate the reality of psychodemography. I would like them to grasp why it is that I say properly that work focused on variables with respect to which individuals have been differentiated, whether by tests or by experimental treatments, generates knowledge of populations and not knowledge of the individuals in the populations. I would like them to get that. I would like them to get that I appreciate that psychodemographic work has a value. There's a place for it. And that I would not want them to come away thinking that I'm just a vicious critic of psychodemographic work. I'm not. I would like them to appreciate, thirdly, that while psychodemographic work has value, maybe this is a repetition of the first point, it's not psychology. It's not psychology, simply because it doesn't tell us anything about individuals. And I can't imagine a sensible scientific psychology that has nothing authoritative to say about the doings, the psychological doings, whatever, sensations, perceptions, judgments, cognitions, memories, development, all of it, of individuals. Like, I just cannot imagine a psychology like that. Maybe that's a three-pronged one takeaway.
Yeah.
A second takeaway, and it's not so much a takeaway, but it's a reference and a go-to for those psychologists who would respond to me, as many have in the past, by saying, well, okay, your argument's good, but what are we going to do instead? I wish, for those who want to really have their hands in empirical and even quantitative work, if they would take my recommendation to go look at the work of James Grice. He's cited in the book, and our work is not overlapping, but it is certainly coordinated. It's hand in hand, and I say this because there are options out there. One thing is to embrace more critically, but appreciatively, qualitative work. There's a need for qualitative work. But for those who just can't bring themselves to do that, and they want something more quantitative and systematic, that on its surface at least, it looks just like experimentation that they're used to, that they're familiar with, random assignment of subjects to groups and all this, much more attention to working out, the investigator working out in detail just what she or he theorizes is happening with his or her individual subjects as they go through these experimental treatments, and then analyzing the data in ways that address those questions. Are they going through those things? How many of them are? How many of them aren't? That's a viable psychology in my view, and I want them, I would hope that in my, mainly from my last chapter, where you might pick up takeaway points, that my views on this matter are made explicit. I take an example of a research project that had to do with the Tulsa schools, and that project was done by people whom I know, colleagues and graduate students at Georgetown. And I respect that work, and I know those people, and I respect those people, and they're good people. And psychodemography is worth doing, and here's why, and here's what it looks like, and here's why it's not psychology. And now you want to do psychology, use psychodemography as a springboard, if you will. You can see things in psychodemographic findings that raise hypotheses about psychological processes that you could then in turn investigate in using different methods suitable for psychological investigations. That I'm not urging, I don't know how many points this is, too many takeaway points.
They are all important points, so I like what you're saying, yes.
I'm not, in a sense, I'm not inventing a new psychology. When you say, well, you can't do psychology scientifically studying individuals, again, I may have hit on this point last week. Really? What about what Wundt was doing? What about what Ebbinghaus was doing? And in your own textbooks, these people are held up as the pioneers of the discipline. So come on, folks, just look at your own history. You can see that's not only can be done, it's the way it was done once upon a time. And I hope I've been able to raise sensitivity to the fact, and I see it as a fact, that these issues have ethical implications as well as epistemic implications. When you're using tests to make decisions that are heavily influential on people's lives, yet on the basis of claims to knowledge about those individuals that are not valid, this is not just getting it wrong in a scientific sense. You're doing things that it seems to me are at least ethically questionable. I won't go so far as to call them unethical, but you have to see yourself as subscribing to an ethics that is interested in what's best for the most in the long run, so to speak. It's not scrupulously respectful of individuals, and so okay. If you're going to do that, it's not my ethics, but if you're going to do that, at least be clear about it, be explicit about it. Yeah, I don't even think to get some out of that book, they wouldn't have that much to know about psychology, at least on the critical part. It's just thinking about, and it's a tough nut, statistics and probability. That is language that is just about everywhere in contemporary discourse, about everything. And if in that domain of discourse, and I'm talking about probability, people can come to a clearer appreciation of the difference between probabilistic knowledge and probabilistic beliefs, that would be the main thing, and where one applies and the other doesn't, and vice versa. And boy, nowadays with COVID being this and that and the other thing, and you just, every time I almost cringe when I hear people saying, well, my chance of getting COVID is, minuscule or whatever. And not really, but I don't know, Roberto, how, well, here I go again. That's a tough takeaway, I think. It's so common as part of the discourse in our society to take probabilistic knowledge that is irrevocably tied to populations and interpret it as if it were probabilistic knowledge about oneself or about the individual other person with whom one is concerned, instead of the basis for expressing a belief about oneself or about another. When it's treated as knowledge, it is seen to be given the stamp of scientific approval, and I think it's I think we would have a better society if we were clear on this distinction. But again, I don't know, for laypersons to come away with that, that's a tall order.
Okay, so that was the last part of my conversation with Professor James Lamiell. I hope it was really interesting for you as it was for me. And as usual, if you want to hear the uncut version of our conversation, with some more exchange between him and I, then you can just check the podcast. And if you want to read more about it, you can check my blog. And if you have already seen the videos, just keep checking, because I will be putting up more videos about this topic or very related topics. So as you know, in this channel, we are about self-primacy, which is about behavioral science, which is about individuality. And that's what this interview was so valuable for. But anyway, please let me know what you think about this interview, about this 3-part interview, and about the book. If you have read already a bit about it, I will be happy to know what you think. And yeah, if you have any other ideas about interviews that you would like me to do, or some topic that you would like me to address as a psychologist, or just any interesting fact about ourselves and our identities and how we can improve ourselves, and just drop your ideas and I will be happy to address it. So thank you for watching this video. Give me your like, give me your subscription, and I assure you that will motivate me to keep working on this topic. So see you later.